Politics and poetry have been closely linked for many centuries, right from the earliest poems, recorded poems, of ancient Greek civilization to the rap artists of today in the United States and other parts of the world. The character of poetry or political poetry has changed, but the aim has remained the same, to both reflect and to propose utopias. So what brought this about and when did it all begin? Poetry itself as an art form has been with us in some shape or form ever since humanity learned to express itself. Poetry initially could have been simple sounds linked to body language, expressing needs, mating, for instance, love later, primitive music. As language developed, early poetry in the shape of songs became a form of universal expression. And yet, there has always been in poetry an element both of resistance and of reflection. If you look at the two great poets of the ancient Greek world, Homer and Hesiod, Homer writes about something very familiar to us, war, about the traumas and troubles of war, and what happens when soldiers stay away from their families for a long time, as well as about the effect that all this has on how wars are fought in all its gory detail. This is a world that can be understood in terms of our own experiences as well. If you read, for instance, some of Homer today and see in front of you images of Iraq or going further back, the First World War, the Second World War, the words fit the images perfectly. So the universal themes taken up by the ancients are very much present with us today. Hesiod, who also lived in the ancient Greek world, is a very different type of poet from Homer. We know much more about him. We know where he came from, who his father was, and the society in which he lived. If you take Hesiod's great work, Works and Days, it has a modern feel to it, although written in very ancient times. Hesiod's ancient Greek society possessed great wealth. Its dazzling urban culture has been written about a great deal, but the cash flow was supplied by the countryside, wealth from wine and oil, and corn that was controlled by private landed proprietors. In the countryside lived peasants, game, and immigrant laborers there for seasonal work. When there were no more jobs available, the laborers moved on. Hesiod describes all of this in different ways in Works and Days, making it a very contemporary piece of writing. The poet's father, we know, was a migrant worker. Hesiod described him well as someone in flight, and he was fleeing, you can be sure, not from wealth and good things, but from loathsome poverty. Hesiod writes, "Work is no disgrace. It is idleness which is a disgrace." This is relevant today, and not just in contemporary Greece, which is a place of great hardship, but even in many advanced parts of the world, in the United States, as well as many countries in Europe and Asia. They will tell you that too. We have in these two great ancient Greek poets and their equally gifted Roman successors an image of the world that does not go away. However much this world changes, many things remain the same. And similar poems, though perhaps not of that scale, come in other cultures as well. In China, ancient China, poems tended to be incredibly vicious satires against the rulers of the day. Vicious, scabrous, satirical, and angry. In India, you have the great work, the Vedas, the religious work of ancient Hindu culture. There you find a hint of Homer, descriptions of wars, the gory details, the gods and goddesses. But let's move now to a later period, to the 17th century and after, the periods of revolution, firstly in Europe. If you take the English Revolution of the 17th century, it divided the country through a long and brutal civil war, which ultimately led to the execution of King Charles I, the first king to be executed in Europe after a public trial. People forget that there was an open and transparent discussion about this act. Should we kill the king or not? It is one of the more fascinating discussions in English history. There were contingent reasons. He lies. We try and make deals with him, but he goes behind our back. He organizes against us. What to do? If he's going to organize a counter-revolution, then the only alternative is to try him in court and execute him. There was a trial, and after it, they killed the king, making England a republic without a House of Lords, a commonwealth with Oliver Cromwell at its head. Cromwell appointed a Secretary of State, a very brilliant young scholar, John Thurlow, who built the network of English spies, the original British intelligence service. When Thurlow called his weekly Monday morning meeting to discuss the state of Europe and the strategy of the English Revolutionary Republic towards it, sitting across the table from him were three of the greatest poets of the time, John Milton, John Dryden, and Andrew Marvell. What were they discussing? Not poetry, I can tell you that. The discussions were about what was happening in Europe, the political debates of the time, who their enemies were, how their enemies were behaving, and what to do. Milton played an absolutely decisive role in some of these discussions. And after the defeat of the revolution, with the restoration of the monarchy, Milton produced what is regarded as a masterpiece of English and world literature, Paradise Lost. That poem is a record of defeat, but also the hopes that were aroused at the early stages of the revolution. So the only way we can understand the work is by seeing it as written by a person who was centrally involved in the struggle of the English Revolution, as Milton was. One can imagine the pain he felt. And so, in a way that surprised people, Paradise Lost sometimes portrayed Satan, the rebel angel, very sympathetically. Milton, after all, has him say, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." The culture that was produced by the defeat of the revolution saw literary and poetic masterpieces. And yet, Paradise Lost is also filled with anger. This was a Europe which was at war, the wars of the Reformation, Protestants fighting Catholics, 100 years of war all over the European continent. And so Milton, using Old Testament frameworks, took that war to heaven and also to hell. Angels, rebellious angels, fighting each other, and the result was a total and complete masterpiece, not studied enough to this day. The culture of that period saw literary masterpieces, but it also saw something else that we can witness today. When there is a big political defeat, many people, especially from within the intelligentsia and radical circles as well, shift allegiances. This is nothing new. The French revolutionary process ignited subsequent European revolutions, and the next wave of poets, the progenitors, if you like, of radical commitment, the poetry of commitment, were inspired by the French Revolution. We might start with William Wordsworth. But he became disillusioned very quickly. His disillusionment began in 1793, when the revolution took a more radical course, trying the king and queen and executing them. Then Wordsworth denounced it and said, "This is not what I wanted." But you know, the course of events in France did not depend on what Wordsworth wanted or not. He retreated to a pastoral conservatism, and another radical poet, Percy Shelley, wrote these lines to him in public. "In honored poverty, thy voice did weave songs consecrate to truth and liberty. Deserting these, thou leavest me to grieve, thus having been, that thou should cease to be." These words could apply to many people today and on every continent. Nonetheless, in the decades after the French Revolution, we see an amazing outpouring of poetry from the great English Romantic poets, Shelley, Keats, and Byron. Shelley was without doubt the most radical. In his book on Goethe, George Lukács, the late Hungarian Marxist literary critic, and many other things, describes Shelley as a revolutionary genius. He cites Shelley's Prometheus Unbound as a work that, quote, celebrated the liberation of Prometheus as a sign of the real struggle for the liberation of humanity. Before Prometheus Unbound, Shelley had written one of the great radical poems in English history, The Masque of Anarchy, following the massacre of Peterloo in Manchester in 1819. He was on holiday in Lake Livorno in Italy, and news came that English soldiers had gone into Manchester and massacred poor people demonstrating for social and political rights. Writing on the spur of the moment, Shelley had to negotiate endlessly for anyone to publish the poem. 2 stanzas were initially censored, but even the poem as first published was very radical. "As I lay asleep in Italy, there came a voice from over the sea, and with great power it forth led me to walk in the visions of poesy." Then the poet introduces Lord Liverpool's cabinet to his readership, starting with the Foreign Secretary of that time, Lord Castlereagh. "I met murder on the way, he had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked, yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. All were fat, and well they might be in admirable plight, for 1 by 1 and 2 by 2 he tossed them human hearts to chew, which from his white cloak he drew." Then Shelley introduces the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Elton. "Next came Fraud, and he had on, like Lord E., an ermined gown. His big tears, for he wept well, turned to millstones as they fell." And so on. It is a long poem, and he ends with an invocation, a call for an uprising, which created absolute mayhem. The Conservatives went crazy. Shelley wrote in Men of England, "Sow seed, but let no tyrant reap. Find wealth, let no impostor heap. Weave robes, let not the idle wear. Forge arms in your defense to bear." Shelley ends too with an appeal to the people of England. "Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. The message is simple. If you remain inactive and passive, you chain yourselves. This tradition lasted for a long time in England. It is in William Blake too, but it had grown out of the French Revolution, out of its defeat, so to speak, though it was a defeat the poets did not want to accept. These poems sang of new possibilities. One poet who came to his peak following a defeat, that is the victory of fascism in Germany, was the great German poet Bertolt Brecht. Some of his finest poetry was written in the aftermath of that defeat. We must say of all these great communist poets of the 20th century, Brecht in Germany, Pablo Neruda in Chile, Nasim Hikmat in Turkey, Faiz Ahmed Faiz in Pakistan, Louis Aragon in France, and of the great surrealist poets André Breton and others, who were not officially communist, but part of the culture of the left in the time, that they were rock-solid internationalists. Their links to communism made them think about the world as a whole. Their attraction to communism deprovincialized them for life. They couldn't just write about themselves or their love lives or their own countries. They thought about the world, though of course they wrote about love too. This was the Poets' International. The internationalism of these poets was remarkable. Brecht's especially so, because he'd read everything. In particular, he was attracted to the very pro-imperialist poetry of Rudyard Kipling, not because he agreed with Kipling politically, but because he loved the rhymes and the rhythms that Kipling produced, many of which are fantastic. Kipling was the only poet who managed to capture the rhythms of speech of working-class white soldiers in imperialist occupied lands. A poem that Kipling wrote, for instance, about British soldiers in India serving Queen Victoria, gives us the Cockney rhythms of working-class white soldiers. Have you heard of the widow at Windsor, with a hairy gold crown on her head? She has ships on the foam, she has millions at home, and she pays us poor beggars in red. Oh, poor beggars in red. Then here's to the widow at Windsor, and here's to the stores and the guns, the men and the horses, what makes up the forces of Mrs. Victoria's sons. Poor beggars, Victoria's sons. Brecht was so fascinated by the poem that he wrote a response, a wonderful response, an unfinished poem written at the market on the Caledonian Road in London, titled The Caledonian Market. In it, the German poet offers no sympathy for those serving in an imperialist army. He mocks Kipling. "Oh, east is east and west is west," their hireling minstrel cried. But I observed with interest bridges across that great divide, and huge guns trundling east I've seen, and cheerful troops keeping them clean. Meanwhile, from east to west, back rolled tea soaked in blood, war-wounded, gold. And the widow at Windsor, all dressed in black, grins, takes the money, stuffs it in her pocket, and gives the wounded a pat on the back and sends them down to the Caledonian market. Their walk may have lost its spring, but they try to hobble around the stalls and buy a second-hand wooden leg instead to match their equally wooden head. Brecht has little sympathy for those who were serving in an imperialist army. But the same Brecht, communist Brecht, when he witnessed an uprising in Berlin against the East German communist regime in 1953, after the death of Stalin, and saw workers being gunned down, what did he do? The slander is that he supported it. He never supported it. He wrote a quatrain in the Eastern style in the shape of a letter to the Politburo called The Solution. After the uprising of the 17th June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalin Alley stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier in that case for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? What could be more vicious than that piece of satire? He had called out leaders suggesting they dissolve the people. His revolutionary sensibility survived every setback. Let us switch now from Europe to the Arab world in 1967, haunted as it was by the experience of the defeat in war that year. The great Syrian Arab poet Nizar Qabbani wrote a poem titled Marginal Notes in the Book of Setbacks. It's a huge poem. Here is but one key section, wherein, like Shelley in the 19th century, Qabbani invokes something other than setbacks. Arab children, corn ears of the future, you will break our chains, kill the opium in our heads, kill the illusions. Arab children, don't read about our suffocated generation. We are a hopeless case, as worthless as a watermelon rind. Don't read about us, don't ape us, don't accept us, don't accept our ideas. We are a nation of crooks and jugglers. Arab children, spring rain, corn ears of the future, you are the generation that will overcome defeat. I was thinking about this poem when the Arab Spring began in Tunisia and later spread to Tahrir Square in Cairo. How happy it would have made Qabbani to see the beginnings of a process that has not yet come to an end despite the victory of the old regimes in both countries in different ways. But this tradition in Arab poetry, and indeed the poetry of the Indian subcontinent, remains strong to this day, even though we no longer have huge gatherings. Young people watch recitations of these old poems on the internet and on YouTube non-stop. In Pakistan, the great radical poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz wrote some beautiful poetry. He was a great love poet, a lyrical poet. Eventually, he wrote this poem to his mistress, who was badgering him and harassing him, saying, "You've become a bore, you've become political, you don't see me." In reply, he wrote a poem called Love, Do Not Ask. Love, do not ask me for that old love again. Once I thought life, because you lived, a prize. Time's pain, nothing. You alone were pain. Your beauty kept earth's springtime from decay. It was not true all this, but only wishing. Our world knows other torments than love, and other happinesses than a fond embrace. Dark curse of countless ages, savagery interwoven with silk and satin and gold lace, men's bodies sold in street and marketplace, bodies that caked grime fouls and thick blood smears, flesh issuing from the cauldrons of disease, with festered sores dripping corruption. These sights haunt me too, and will not be shut out. Not be shut out, though your looks ravish still. This world knows other torments than those of love, and other happinesses than a fond embrace. Love, do not ask for my old love again. The poem goes on, and it had a huge impact because these poems written by intellectual poets reached the masses when they were sung by great divas. The same occurred in the Arab world. Qabbani's poetry and that of others was sung by Kulthum. Egypt's great singer and actress. And when Kulthum sang it, it was heard by the Arab nation. Whether they were banned or not, truck drivers played CDs as they drove their trucks from one country to the other, listening to this poetry. When the partition of India happened, Faiz wrote a wonderful poem saying that this is not the road we wanted. He described this independence as a pock-marked dawn, a day that will not come out because night has still gripped it. This is not what we were promised. Then he ends, carry on our struggle, it's not over yet. And several years before he died, he wrote the poem Aaj Ke Naam, or in today's name, for the people of the country and for the poor. This poem too was sung. Or consider the very great Turkish poet Nasim Hikmat, who was locked up in a Turkish prison. There were huge campaigns for him and appeals signed by everyone. He fled to the Soviet Union. But when there was an amnesty in Turkey, he returned. They tried to kill him. They conscripted him into the army. The doctor who inspected him said, "They have told me to declare you healthy, but 3 days in the sun, my friend, given the state of your heart, and you will die. You will drop dead, and they will say he had a heart attack and died. You'd better get out." So he took a small boat and, helped by fishermen, sailed out into the sea where there were lots of Soviet and Eastern European ships. By luck, he found a Romanian ship. The ship's sailors didn't know who he was, but they saw people crying for help. Hikmat describes finally being hauled onto that ship and going into the captain's room. The captain says, "Who are you?" Hikmat replies, "I'm Nasim Hikmat, the Turkish communist poet, and they're going to try and kill me, so I need to get out. Take me wherever you can." The captain laughs and points, and behind him there is a picture of Hikmat, part of the campaign saying, "Free Nasim Hikmat." For all who are interested in the state of the world and its ecology, consider Hikmat's interesting poem on living. Living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness, like a squirrel, for example. I mean, without looking for something beyond and above living. I mean, living must be your whole occupation. Living is no laughing matter. You must take living seriously, so much so and to such a degree that, for example, your hands tied behind your back to the wall, or else in a laboratory in your white coat and safety glasses, you can die for people, even for people whose faces you've never seen, even though you know living is the most real, the most beautiful thing. And Hikmat ended with a materialist invocation. This earth will grow cold, a star among stars and one of the smallest, a gilded mote on blue velvet. I mean this, our great earth. This earth will grow cold one day, not like a block of ice or a dead cloud even, but like an empty walnut. It will roll along in pitch-black space. You must grieve for this right now. You have to feel this sorrow now, for the world must be loved this much if you're going to say, "I lived." This poem was written in February 1948, at the height of the Cold War. My favorite Israeli poet, Aharon Shabtai, who writes in Hebrew and writes to his people poems of startling intensity, warning them, "Don't say you don't know. You do know what's going on, and one day, what will you say when you're sitting in a court of law and they say to you, 'Why did you not speak up?' You cannot say we did not know." Poets like this in today's world make us see the power of poetry. It remains universal, whether it's Shelley or Kabani, or whether it's a rap artist. This power will not go away, regardless of other things that have happened.